welcome back. Let us talk about the Hell-Volhard-Zelinsky reaction. You might think that's quite the name for a reaction, but it's basically the name of the three dudes that that came up with this reaction. That made the studies, and explain what was happening. So we have Carl Magnus von Hell. I mean, that's a hell of a name, and a hell of a beer, if you ask me. Then we have Jacob Volhard with in comparison, a much more simplistic and moderate beer. And of course, there is Nikolai Zelinsky, which have more of a goatee thing going for him. But basically, these gentlemen were the ones that did the studies of this reaction. And what the reaction is all about is looking at a carboxylic acid. So now we're kind of switching gears a little bit, no longer concentrating on aldehydes and ketones, but looking at a carboxylic acid and basically making it so that we can brominate the alpha position of that carboxylic acid. Now the way that they did it back in those days was by first producing tribromophosphine, and this they had to do in situ. So like they would form it, and as soon as they form it, they would react it right away. They would do that by reacting elemental phosphorus with bromine. So technically speaking, the way this will work is phosphorus plus plenty of bromine, and at the end of the reaction, they will then quench it with water to get the carboxylic acid. So basically, the way that this will work out is that once the PBr3 was formed, this will react with the carboxylic acid for the sole purpose of turning the carboxylic acid into an acyl bromide. And you may recall from our previous videos that I mentioned that an acyl halide, such as this one, has a higher propensity, much higher propensity than a carboxylic acid, of undergoing tautomerization to the corresponding enol, right? So doing this reaction with PBr3, as you'll see through the subsequent mechanism, what you'll notice is that there's plenty of Br anion around to act as a potential base to remove that proton from your acyl bromide and form the enol. And once you're in the enol stage, along with plenty of Br2 around in solution, you can ultimately brominate that position. Now, technically speaking, that direct product is the monobromination of the acyl bromide. But once you treat this with water, which is the second step in this reaction, you turn the acyl bromide back into a carboxylic acid. So that's kind of the way that this will work out. And pretty relatively, smart way to do it, at least at those times. I'm going to show you an even smarter way of doing it momentarily. But first, let's look at the mechanism of the Hell-Volhard-Zelinsky reaction. All right, so the first thing that happens is that the carboxylic acid attacks phosphorus. And one of the reasons why that happens is because of the high presence of, or the high number of electronegative elements, the halogens in this case, on phosphorus, right? So render the phosphorus relatively acidic in that respect. So one way to look at it is that the lone pairs of the singly bonded oxygen move over towards the carbonyl carbon. They kick those electrons out so that now you attack your phosphorus, and then you end up with phosphorus bound on the top oxygen, as you can see right here. Now the phosphorus has technically this negative charge, right? So what happens now is that one of the bromo substituents leaves the phosphorus as a neutral species. Now you have a bromide that has been generated, and for right now your technical carbonyl is protonated. So while that carbonyl is protonated, yes, you have activated the carbonyl carbon, but you have also activated the alpha hydrogens. And all of this stuff is basically an equilibrium, right? So the bromine can attack the carbonyl carbon, moving those electrons back to the oxygen and creating this intermediate that you see right here. At this point, what happens is that your oxygen reforms the carbonyl carbon-oxygen double bonds, and in doing so, it kicks away the phosphine oxide intermediate. Now, technically speaking, this has a negative charge, but ultimately breaks down into a single oxygen, single phosphorus, single Br component, and it kicks another equivalent of Br minus, which now is floating around. And it's important to note that because what we generated right here is a protonated acyl bromide derivative. And that derivative is very much prone to undergoing tautomerization to the enol form. So much so that the bromide that's kind of lingering around in solution comes around, removes that proton from the alpha position. The electrons come back to the carbonyl carbon to form your carbon-carbon double bond, and then the electrons of the carbonyl go back to oxygen to leave you with the enol derivative. And once you have that enol derivative, the oxygen will basically go back down to reform the carbonyl CO double bond, and then the electrons of that carbon-carbon double bond will attack bromine to ultimately leave you with the monobrominated acyl bromide that for the moment remains protonated. So here, once again, you're removing a Br minus, so you have now extra Br minus present in solution, which comes back around to remove that proton and leave you with your acyl bromide. All right, now, as I mentioned before, what Hell-Volhard-Zelinsky did at this point is to simply quench the reaction with water, which will turn this thing into a carboxylic acid. But because of that logic, you also have the option to quench it with alcohol. And if you do that, you won't get a carboxylic acid, you will get an ester instead. And that might be actually a better choice for subsequent chemistry. So I'm going to give you a general kind of look at it. I'm just giving you a very general view of this. R could be H, in which case you're dealing with water. R could be some other carbon chain, in which case you're dealing with an alcohol. But the idea is that this will attack your carbonyl carbon, breaking that double bond. You end up with that intermediate. Then one of the lone pairs on that oxygen over here will come back down, and it will kick away the bromo group, so that you end up with a protonated ester. And then the bromide that you've generated can come around and remove that proton out from your ester, right? Assuming it's a carbon chain, right? Because if it's water, then now this is a carboxylic acid. But that's basically how this entire process will work out. And this gives you the option of not only being capable of monobrominating aldehydes and ketones, as we saw in the previous video, but now we have the option of monobrominating carboxylic acids and esters. Okay, so as good as the reaction is, it's a little bit inconvenient, mostly because of the use of phosphorus that has to be enacted in that reaction. Some forms of phosphorus are kind of fine and relatively benign, but because they're also benign, they could be a little less unreactive. For that reaction to work really well, usually you want to use white phosphorus, which tends to be a little less than safe to use. So an alternative to this reaction is to basically do it in multiple steps. Instead of trying to do it all in one step, we could do it in two, I guess technically three steps, as you can see in this slide. So we can avoid using phosphorus altogether if we just go back to thionyl chloride like we've done in the past. And thionyl chloride will do a couple of things. First of all, it will turn that hydroxyl of the carboxylic acid into a chloro group. So now you have an acyl chloride. The thionyl chloride, it's expelled as sulfur dioxide gas. And you also produce HCl out of this mixture. So the HCl that's forming there can then basically protonate the carbonyl oxygen and allow for the tautomerization into the enol form to happen. And once you have that enol, due to the fact that now you can introduce your Br2 in solution, allows you to have the enol getting brominated. And if you react that with water, subsequently you can get your carboxylic acid. If you do the same thing, react carboxylic acid with thionyl chloride, follow that up basically, with the HCl that's there to get to the enol form, and then react it with Br2, but finish it off with an alcohol, then you get the ester. So it's basically the same idea as before, the Hell Hell-Volhard-Zelinsky, route, except that we're not using phosphorus, right? We're just doing it with thionyl chloride. Okay, so one last thing that I should probably tell you to kind of like give you the full scope of why it's important to be able to brominate these alpha positions is because the moment you have a halogen in the alpha position, you have now created a pretty good living group for substitution reactions. So for instance, let's say that we have the following ester that we made either through the Hell-Volhard-Zelinsky reaction, or we did it through the alternative route with thionyl chloride. Well, what you could do is react that alkyl halide with a good nucleophile, especially if it's kind of small and really good like cyanide. Well, then you can replace that bromo group with a cyano group, and all of a sudden you have an ester nitrile. Well, I'll have more to say about what you can do with this type of material in the next lecture, but that gives you an idea of the things you can do, right? Now I'm kind of like gonna spoil this for you because this is meant for the next lecture, but I'll say here just so that you have an idea of why we want to put a cyano group in there. The cyano group, you may recall from our lecture on carboxylic acid derivatives, you can basically, upon treatment with hydronium and a little bit of heat, you can turn that cyano group all the way into a carboxylic acid. So you could have a dicarboxylic acid. This one in particular is malonic acid. I will also have plenty to say about that in the next lecture. And another thing that can happen, and this is definitely the big spoil, the spoiler alert, the spoiler alert, is that in this step of reacting the cyano ester group with hydronium, if you overheat it, you can actually lose one of those two carboxylic acids. We're going to talk about that reaction and how it happens in the next lecture. But following along this route of doing an SN2 attack, you could also do it with an amine, like literally just ammonia, and this will give you an amino ester, which is, as you may have imagined, the direct analog of amino acids. In the case of the molecule that we have here, instead of having a carboxylic acid that would make this into an amino acid, we have an ester. So it's an amino ester, but a direct, derivative of that. And another interesting thing that you could do with this is because now you have an alkyl halide, you could react this with, trialkyl phosphine to make a Vidic reagent, right? So you could treat it with triphenylphosphine, follow that up with a treatment with a strong enough base. And notice that I'm not using a Grignard and I'm not using a lithium reagent, a lithium alkyl reagent, that is, namely because we have an ester right here. So you want to just make sure that the base that you use is the same as the alkoxy group that you have in your ester, but that will allow you to make a Vidic reagent, and then that Vidic reagent can be treated with an alkene or an aldehyde to turn that into an alkene, and then this alkene being next to a carbonyl has a specific reference name. We call that an ene-one. In for alkene, on for ketone, right? And obviously this is not a ketone, but we just use it for all type of carbonyl alkene, partners like this. So we'll investigate a lot of these reactions in future lectures. So keep that in mind. But with that, we'll call it quits for this video, and on the next video we'll talk about how we can do alkylations on the alpha carbon of aldehydes. So see you then.